Welcome to GydeBites. I'm Prasanna, your host. Right now, agentic systems are being positioned as a next big leap in enterprise AI. But beyond demos and headlines, enterprises are still figuring out what actually it takes to make these systems reliable, governed, useful in production. Because building an AI that can reason, act, coordinate across workflows, it's not just a model challenge anymore. It's a data challenge, it's an engineering challenge, and above all, it's a trust challenge. So today we are cutting through the noise around agentic systems and focusing on what's working and where enterprises are still struggling. Joining me today is Mr. Jigar Shah. He is the head of applied AI and platform engineering at Atomic Work. He brings over 20 years of experience across AI enterprise software data platforms with leadership stints at Amazon's AGI organization, ServiceNow, and big business acumen forged at McKinsey and Company and Chicago Booth. His current focus is on multi-agent orchestration, autonomous AI workforce, production grade AI that earns trust through performance, not the hype. Jigar, welcome to GydeBites. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Prasanna. Glad to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. So let's get going real quick. Jigar, where is the noise and where is the rubber hitting the road in agentic system?
Yeah, I think noise is good, right? For a system that's evolving, that's growing, it's good to have the noise, but you have to sort of distill out the what's true and what's not, right? So I think the word agent specifically has become sort of a term that means everything, and at the same time, it means nothing, right? Everybody in the industry has started calling their LLM wrappers an agent, and I think that's the crux of all the confusion and the noise that we're seeing in the market. If you're asking personally about me, how I think about it, I think if you look at a chatbot that's just answering questions, a tool calling LLM can, do one thing, you just ask a question, you ask it, and it gives you a response, right? But an agent, a real agent, and I'm trying to, distill out some of the noise here. A true agent or a real agent would sort of, take an ambiguous goal, sort of decompose it into steps, decide which tools to use, reason through the process, handle failures mid execution, knows when it's stuck, and then it knows when to escalate and sort of delegate it to somebody else, right? While at the same time sort of maintaining all that context across multiple different steps or multi-step workflows, which takes minutes, which take hours. And I think that's fundamentally a very different system from an LLM that just calls a function. So in my opinion, that's basically what I call an agent. Yeah, I think that answers your question.
Sure. So the next logical question is, why do so many agentic AI projects fail, right? Because there are multiple reports that we see that, okay, AI agentic frameworks are being deployed, POC is successful, but when it goes to production, it doesn't work. Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, and I think where the industry goes wrong mostly is when you sort of conflate capability versus reliability. And I'll give an example. So for example, I can build a demo in, say a weekend, where there is an LLM that calls 5 APIs that resolves a ticket. That's not the hard part. I think the hard part, and this is where rubber hits the road, right? When you sort of call it out, is making that work, 10,000 times a day across multiple different enterprise customers, multiple different tenants, where every customer has a different system. They have different data, they have different policies, different permission models, and there is zero tolerance for the agent doing the wrong thing, right? So the gap between a demo agent and a production agent is enormous. And we sometimes, it takes a while for us to sort of inculcate that or at least understand the implications there. And to be honest, most of the work that fills the gap between the demo and the production agent is all the unglamorous engineering stuff that nobody wants to talk about, right? Nobody wants to talk about retries, fallbacks, permission scoping, sort of observability, putting evaluation, auditability of the product itself. Nobody writes blogs and all that stuff because that's engineering 101 and it's pretty much boring. But I think that's where things actually become very real.
Yeah. And you mentioned a little about integrations and data and everything. What do you think data and governance gaps make these systems unreliable in a way? Because you also mentioned about there is zero tolerance for doing something wrong. So what data and governance gaps you feel that it makes agents unreliable?
Yeah. So if I were to sort of rephrase your question, right, when your agent is just answering questions, the worst thing that can happen or the worst case is, the answer is wrong, right? So user comes, reads what it is, what you produce, it realizes the answer is off and then it sort of moves on, right? What you lose here is a little bit of credibility. But when your agent can actually provision a user, say, for example, an Active Directory, it can close a ticket or it can send a message on Slack on behalf of an employee. I think then the failure mode isn't, just it's a wrong answer. It's a wrong action, right? And when you have wrong actions in enterprise systems, that can sort of have real consequences. So, for example, you deprovision the wrong user, you've locked somebody out of their work, you close the wrong ticket, you basically have customer issues falling through the crack, right? So uh, another part of this is customer trust itself. You cannot you cannot take it for granted. So when you think in terms of a multi-tenant system, you have to think in terms of if you are looking at sort of an IT workspace or your IT data set, you have a ticket that's provisioned that's basically emanating from the IT workspace. You cannot have it sent to by mistake to the HR domain or the HR workspace, where it's mostly about policies, it's mostly about governance, right? So having that auditability in place to figure out, here are different workspaces. That's one level of the problem. The second level of the problem is you have multiple different tenants, right? You have multiple different customers on the same. You cannot afford to have retrieval happen in one, execution and action enabling sort of happening in another one. So, there is one thing about having a conversational chat with a bot. There's another thing about where actions are taking place, where it has real world implications on the enterprise side, not just within the organization, like I said, within the HR domain or basically within the IT domain, where there are significant legal policies on the HR side that should not leak into the HR workspace. But you're also talking about the multi-organizational, multi-tenant perspective, where tenants have to be isolated from each other because I think it's a well. Somebody said this very clearly: is you earn trust with every drop and you lose it in buckets. So you have to be very careful with that.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, we are seeing some form of horror stories on various social media, right? That agent deleted the database and so on and so forth. So it just makes sense to have basics in place where you don't give access to environment files. When if it is a coding agent, you multi-tenant the stuff that you are doing for customers and so on and so forth. So do you think what enterprises can do more to overcome these agentic AI challenges? Are there any specific lists that you can share with the audience?
I mean, so when you have multi-agent orchestration, right, this is where it becomes really interesting. I have literally seen instances where the agent that's sort of mimicking a particular human has more access provision rights because it's been given a blanket protocol, a blanket permissions across the board. And so sometimes you have to ask the question: is the agent who's acting on behalf of that particular user, does it have guardrails around it? Have you had that scenario where you can take an action which the human itself is not allowed to, right? So this can become easily trust failing mechanisms. I think putting guardrails on your agents, giving clear responsibility to your agents, creating that hierarchy across your agents in terms of what is the delegation that needs to happen. For example, if you are building an agent that's trying to troubleshoot a VPN issue, it should just know or have guardrails specifically to solving VPN troubleshooting issues, right? It shouldn't know anything else outside of its bound. And that's the best way to sort of build those guardrails and sort of governance. But at the same time, you need to have context across multiple different agents because they're all coming together to sort of orchestrate across this. So, while they should not supersede what a human can do, they have to sort of remain within their bounds. The other one is something we sort of take for granted, which is, since we're used to chatbots and agents sort of reading and sort of, summarizing things for us, and we're not thinking actively, we're actioning and making actions into the system. I think it's good for an LLM or a bot to sort of or an agent to sort of reason through something. But when it comes to sort of making a system actuation of basically if it's committing a change to the system, then the human feedback loop has to come into the play where you have to have the human who comes in and basically approves a particular change. You cannot have the bots basically, if for whatever reason they hallucinate, sort of make changes, system changes, that would be very detrimental. You have to have the humans constantly sort of keeping an eye in terms of, what can actually be committed into the system and what cannot be.
Yeah. And I think you briefly touched upon this, but let's just double click. What do you think are some of the traits of production grade agentic system versus just an AI experiment?
Yeah. So another thing, whenever I do such podcasts or when I do conversations, I always start with the concept of you always have to build your evaluation harness before you actually build any agent. And this is sort of taken for, granted several times. It's not like a traditional ML system where you basically compute an F1 score for an agent and that's supposed to resolve a ticket, because the output is not a classification problem. It's a multi-step workflow where you might be retrieving knowledge, you might be asking a clarifying question or calling an API. So how do you measure that? So I would say the first thing is make sure you build your evaluation harness first, and then you iteratively build the agent based on that evaluation. So that's a production thing, right? Constantly, when you're building it, you constantly have to evaluate and figure out if you're building the right thing that is required for that particular use case. I would say something else is reliability, right? We always think about functionally building sort of the right set of agents and sort of building an environment for them to sort of collaborate with each other. But where I think it becomes really critical is when you sort of help with the orchestration a little bit more and you make them a much more reliable, right? So reliability is absolutely paramount here. So think in terms of, retries. If your system goes down, do you have sort of temporal reliability there? Are you building the system back up again? Is there encryption sort of auto enabled into this? What happens if, the agent sort of completely messes up in between and sort of ends its execution flow in between? Are you managing the state of that particular agent? Are you storing it somewhere else? Does the other agent have the context to sort of pick it up from there and start again, right? So if you're building a very simple demo, it's absolutely fine to sort of build it with 5 agents and sort of prompts that you've tested on the side by yourself, and 5 retrieval documents that you sort of have a very strong recall accuracy on. But it's a completely different ball game when you have no idea what context you're going to be retrieving, right? The document could either be an HR policy, which has a very different structure as compared to an IT procedural document, which has a completely different structure. How do you chunk that strategy? The chunking strategy across all of that has to be very different, pertaining to exactly that particular use case. And like I said, reliability. At the end of the day, if you're not keeping track of what the agent is doing, if you're not thinking about auditability, and I think I should sort of say this again and repeat it a couple of times. Auditability is paramount for it to be an enterprise product. So if you were not if a compliance officer cannot come and look at the audit trace, then I don't think you should be calling yourself an enterprise product. And so part of that, like I said before, is also keeping track of, agent, where the agent dropped off, where the agent picked up. How are you sort of managing the context? Are you just passing tokens around, or are you basically sort of massaging the tokens and making sure the relevant, structured data is extracted for the next agent to act on it? How are you doing handoffs? Right, handoff is a huge engineering problem in terms of, are you basically just picking up tokens from one place and giving it to the other, or are you sort of acting upon it and saying, hey, I want to give you the right tokens for this particular use case, but I don't necessarily want to give you my reasoning trail. Because if I give you my reasoning trail, the next agent is basically going to hallucinate because now it's suddenly got a different chain of thought, which it shouldn't, and it messes up with its own chain of thought. So I think context engineering is another part of sort of, productionizing things. Is like, how are you massaging the data? How are you doing the handoffs between agent 1 and agent 2? What is the hierarchy of those agents? When should you delegate? When should you not delegate? Because many a times what happens is, and we've seen this happen, is when you think about AI workforce use cases, agents are constantly doing handoffs, and it's basically being a ping pong game, right? If you pass it on, it passes it back to you. So you have to have clear guidelines and examples of, here is a use case, here is when you delegate, here is when you want to get delegate or how you over delegate. Meanwhile, all your evaluation harness is running at the same time, evaluating whether you're doing a good job in terms of delegating things or not, whether the context is, appropriate to what you're sending, whether your tool calls are very effective. So I cannot emphasize enough on putting the evaluation harness first. And second is just making sure you have a very clear organizational structure of your agents. You have the right guardrails for them. You have reliability baked in, and you have auditability, which is sort of a, given. You cannot compromise that.
Yeah, I mean, makes sense totally to me. So, and auditability, observability, reproducibility, all of that sort of is paramount if you are working with regulated industries, right? I mean, if financial services, healthcare, the regulator can come and ask you 3 months later that why this credit file was approved and so on and so forth, and you have to reproduce that as an output 3 months later. And if you cannot do that, it's going to be a challenge for an enterprise. So totally makes sense of what you're saying. Jigar will move to the next section. So we always ask our guests to leave one piece of practical advice, whether they are building agents, whether they are using, let's say, agent SDKs and so on and so forth. What would you like to tell them?
This is a hard one. There's so many things I could sort of add. Yeah, like I said, I'll sound like a broken record, but you have to have your eval harness before you build the agent, right? So I'm not going to repeat it, but, start with 20 real world queries from your users, write them down, write down the ideal agent behavior you should see for each one of them, not just the final answer, but sort of the steps it takes, the reasoning through that. Create your eval set, stare at it, think about it for a while. This is your business problem, which has been sort of embedded into that small space of your eval set, and think about hard about what you're sort of evaluating and testing. Second, I would say is start narrow, right? I've seen sort of people trying to boil the ocean, but don't try to build a general purpose agent that sort of handles everything, right? Pick one workflow where automation has the highest impact and also the lowest risk, right? Maybe it's just answering common ID questions from a knowledge base, or routing tickets to the right team. But nail that one thing to make your entire system more reliable. So that helps you build the trust with your users, and then you can expand, right? So I've often seen teams sort of boiling the ocean from day one, but that usually doesn't really work very well. Third, if I can add, is just instrument everything from the start, right? Auditability. We're repeating this again and again, but log every LLM call, every retrieval, every tool invocation, every user interaction, right? You will need this data, and you will need it for debugging, when something goes wrong. I cannot tell you the number of times that when a new employee joins the company, the best way for them to learn is basically to look at the trace of a particular, agent orchestration system, because the amount you can learn from exactly what's happening in the real runtime system, I mean, you just can't replace that, right? So you need to understand those usage patterns. Yeah. If I can just add one more additional point is, respect the LLM's limitations. Usually there is this idea of just throw it to the LLM and the LLM figure it out. The most reliable agents are the ones that are honest with you and basically say, what, I don't know, and maybe I don't have all the context, right? Because if you work with an LLM that's basically always trying to make you happy and please you, then you're basically going to run into a lot of hallucinations, right? And that's not good. So, LLMs are great, and for all the powers that they behold and they do have their limitations, and we need to respect that.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jigar. Before we wrap up, there is a short rapid fire round as well. So just share first thing that comes to your mind. Are you ready to go? Okay. So one misconception people have about agentic systems.
That it starts with a demo and it's basically using existing frameworks and you're off to the races.
One mistake enterprises make while building agentic systems.
Not think about auditability. I think I'm repeating this again and again, and not building the eval harness before, right? Just jumping onto the use case first.
One capability every production grade agentic system should have.
Again, I'm going to say the same thing, is the ability to sort of manage your state, have context of what you have done so far, and sort of, act upon that state and pull it up when you need. So managing your agent state is going to be critical.
Okay. This is a little different. One thing teams underestimate while deploying the enterprise agents or AI systems.
The LLM's capability. They think, once you sort of throw it all over to the other side, the LLM basically will take care of it.
And one trend that you want enterprises to watch out for.
Relying too much on existing frameworks and leveraging what's in open source, but not sort of thinking this as, if you're a product, if you're not just a feature, but if you're a product, building that capability internally within your team to sort of make you much more amenable to sort of changes that may happen within the ecosystem outside for you to be independent.
Cool. Jigar, thank you so much for these responses, and thank you for joining us today and bringing so much clarity, right, for the agentic systems as a space, because it's literally everywhere you speak to anyone, they're talking about, hey, we are building agents, we are building agentic systems and so on. But thank you so much for bringing this clarity to our audience.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thanks, Prasanna.
All right, and thanks everyone for listening. And if you have enjoyed this episode, do share it with your network. Stay tuned for more conversations around AI. This was GydeBites. Thank you.